and that servant
that don't obey his Lord
shall be beaten with many stripes.
That's scripture.
America must always lead on the world stage. If we don't, no one else will.
Laws that allow us to diminish the humanity of anybody are not laws.
Here, I can choose to do with my property whatever I so desire.
Congress must never declare equal those whom God created unequal.
This settles the fate for all coming time, not only of the millions now in bondage, but of unborn millions to come.
I believe in American exceptionalism with every fiber of my being. But what makes us exceptional is not our ability to flout international norms and the rule of law. It is our willingness to affirm them through our actions.
I believe we, and particularly you, your class, has an incredible window of opportunity to lead in shaping a new world order for the 21st century in a way consistent with American interest and the common interest.
In our previous study, we saw how the first kingdom, the Papacy, openly, through countless documents, said how she wants a new world order. We've just seen that the second kingdom, the United States, has not just a president, but the vice president has openly said they want a new world order. Both of the two kingdoms have the same agenda. But there's still going to be people who say that China, which has the second largest economy in the world, she just done a deal, a $400 billion deal with Russia, where they're going to supply 30 years of natural resource, which is oil and gas. But prophetically, China does not play in the prophetic picture. In this study, we're going to see how God blessed the Protestant nations of Europe. But instead of following the principles of the martyrs like Wycliffe, they followed the principle of the papacy. While being delivered from the bondage of slavery of the papacy, they decided that they were going to put another race into bondage and slavery, as we'll see in this study.
The huge piece of land in the Northern Hemisphere, the United States of America, is a cultural melting pot of different nationalities. But who is it named after? According to Webster's New Universal Unabridged Dictionary, the name America is derived from Americus Vespucius, the Latin name of Amerigo Vespucci, an Italian navigator. Amerigo Vespucci was an Italian merchant born in Florence, Italy, who is believed to have made a trip around the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic coast from Florida to the Chesapeake Bay, and he was convinced that the newly discovered lands, where both the North and South bear his name, was not part of Asia, but a new world. But his mission of exploration was part of a wider global strategy by the most powerful geopolitical system on Earth.
Academy Award winner Jeremy Irons is Rodrigo Borgia.
I think this is going to blow people's socks off. Well, the Borgias is about power. The Borgias as a family, the most powerful, bloodthirsty, immoral bunch that you could wish for.
Roderick Borgia, who later became Pope Alexander VI, was born into a dynasty that dominated Italy, the Borgias, in one of the most corrupted episodes of the papacy's history, even though she's always been corrupt. He embarked on a scheme that fulfilled Bible prophecy. As the King of the North, the prophetic description of the papacy in Daniel chapter 11, where it records how he shall cause them to rule over many and shall divide the land for gain. Pope Alexander VI divided the world, and it was called the Pope's Line, where Spain was given the lands west of the line and Portugal the lands to the east. The Portuguese were not happy with the arrangement, so the Pope authored the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 that was signed by Ferdinand and Isabel of Spain and John II of Portugal that gave Portugal a cut to the parts of the west. When the Islamic Moors were driven out by Ferdinand and Isabel in 1492, the Western world's navigational hero was to rise to prominence. His name is Christopher Columbus. When Christopher Columbus landed in the Americas, he didn't actually discover it, for people were living there already. He was only expanding the Roman Catholic Papal Empire, where he brought with him the brutality of the auto de fe, the act of faith, better known as the Spanish Inquisition, and he murdered innocent souls in the name of Rome. Another Spanish explorer, Hernando de Soto, led the first European expedition deep into the territory of the United States into the Mississippi River. In 1539, the Spanish conquistador landed with a force of 600 armed men, more than 200 horses, hundreds of wolfhounds, mastiffs and greyhounds, a huge supply of neck chains for the slaves they planned to capture, and a portable forge in case that supply proved inadequate. But it is when you travel through London, England, and when you observe the monuments, a symbol of their colonialism, you see which European race later began to dominate North America. When King Henry VIII separated England from the rest of Papal Europe in 1534, though he remained a Roman Catholic till death, the Reformation catapulted under his reign, and England was now independent from the papacy. George W. Bush was the 43rd President of the United States of America. He considers himself as a proud American who protected his country, but really he is of English descent. In the year of his first election in 2000, the English press traced his lineage to England, where his 10 times great-grandfather was Charles Hoare Jr., who in 1634 was fined by the magistrates for giving money to aid a persecuted Puritan clergyman. Most people who have a basic knowledge of English migration to the Americas know that the Pilgrim Fathers left England in 1620 to start a new life in the New World, and on board the ship they signed the Mayflower Compact to set up a new colony that they labelled Plymouth. But they were not the first English colony. In St. Paul's in London, across the road from the Old Bailey, the Central Criminal Court of England and Wales, is a church on Holborn Viaduct called St. Sepulchre without Newgate Church. And inside of this church are the remains of the man who was a part of the setting up of the first English colony. And as the plaque reads, Captain John Smith was the governor of Virginia and admiral of New England. Captain John Smith was an English explorer and soldier who named the Virginia colony New England and set up Jamestown in 1607. He was captured by the natives, and according to Smith's own account, he was about to be executed when the chief's daughter, Pocahontas, threw herself over his body and saved him, where he continued to rule Jamestown. But according to Disney's version of history, colonialism never happened, and the meeting between the old and new worlds is another love conquers all narrative. Hollywood's repetitive rewriting of history always presents Pocahontas as this shapely, high-fashion supermodel, and it bleaches colonialism of its genocidal legacy. No mention is made that John Smith and his countrymen would ultimately ruin Pocahontas' land, bringing disease, death, and poverty to her people, destroying their economic livelihood and their entire way of life. Jamestown was set up as a market economy, and the English colonization of Virginia had two groups of capitalists, one from Bristol, the other from London. Northern Virginia fell to the Bristol group, which was New England, and Southern Virginia fell to the Londoners that included the future Maryland and Carolina. They recruited Polish workers to work in this English national enterprise with its hundreds of stockholders, and from its inception and its embryonic beginnings, it was a capitalist money-making market economy, and any European nation who entered into the New World was incorporated into the English colonies. Along came the Dutch from Holland, and they employed Henry Hudson, an English sea explorer and navigator who explored the river that is named after him for the Dutch East India Company. The Protestant Dutch Calvinist colony was named New Netherlands or New Amsterdam for the Dutch, and in 1626, according to Dutch tradition, Peter Minuit, the first governor of New Amsterdam, bought the land from the natives on an island that the natives called Mannahatta, which today we call Manhattan. Here is a copy of the letter of the actual purchase by the Dutch representative Peter Schungen. Peter Stuyvesant was the last Dutch governor of the short-lived New Amsterdam. The son of a Calvinist minister, he lost his leg in a battle against the Portuguese where it was amputated, and as governor of New Amsterdam, he ruled it with a rod of iron, where he persecuted other Protestants such as the Lutherans and the Quakers. The British wanted to expand their territory, and in a number of wars, King Charles II seized New Netherlands, and Charles granted it to his brother, James, the Lord High Admiral who commanded the Royal Navy. And before he was king, he was created the 5th Duke of York, and New Amsterdam was renamed in his honor in a state we today call New York, after the Duke of York. And the Dutch were permanently under English rule. Next came the French in the 17th century. René Robert Cavier got permission by the Catholic King Louis XIV to purchase a piece of land that was eventually named after the French king, Louisiana, a French Catholic colony. But another set of French immigrants also came to North America, but in the English territory. During the reign of King Louis XIV, another St. Bartholomew's massacre was to be repeated. On the instructions of his French Jesuit confessor to purge the kingdom of Calvinist Huguenot Protestants, a horrific persecution took place where the Protestants, Protection for Religious Liberty, the Edict of Nantes, was revoked, and Protestants fled in their numbers all across Europe, and a small minority fled to North America, well away from the French colony. As the signpost reads, the French and Indian Wars ended French dominance in Ohio that now made it British territory. And during the revolt in the French island of Haiti, it severely economically crippled the French, and Napoleon Bonaparte had to sell the huge French region to the English-speaking North in the famous Louisiana Purchase, and the English dominated over again. The 19th century saw an influx of immigrants from Ireland, and the conflict between the Anglo-Saxon English Protestants and the Irish Catholic Gaelics in the Old World continued in the New World, where the Irish were treated harshly by the English-dominated North American culture. And to make matters worse, in the most intense period of the American Civil War, the Irish abandoned ship after a letter from Pope Pius IX, leaving the North to defend for themselves. When the Irish looked for jobs, they were rejected because of their position in the Civil War, and were only given the lowest menial work to do. So the Irish Catholic hierarchy decided to mobilize the Irish into a well-organized political unit. In a 19th century book titled 50 Years in the Church of Rome, an ex-French-Canadian Roman Catholic priest, Charles Chiniquy, documented his conversation in 1851 with Thomas D'Arcy Etienne Hughes McGee, an Irish nationalist, Catholic spokesman, and journalist who was stationed in Canada and later assassinated by an Irish Fenian. He documented and shared with Chiniquy how a large assembly of priests met in Buffalo in 1852, sent by the bishops of the United States, and recorded their plans for the United States. And this is what the hierarchy of Rome said: "We are determined to take possession of the United States, but we must proceed with utmost secrecy and wisdom. Let us call our poor but faithful Irish Catholics from every corner of the world and gather them into the very hearts of the cities of Washington, New York, Boston, Chicago, Buffalo, Albany, Troy, Cincinnati, etc. Under the shadows of those great cities, the Americans consider themselves a giant unconquerable race. They look upon the poor Irish Catholics with supreme contempt, as only fit to dig their canals, sweep their streets, and work in their kitchens. What will these so-called giants think when not a single senator or member of Congress will be chosen unless he has submitted to our Holy Father, the Pope? We will not only elect the president, but fill and command the armies, man the navies, and hold the keys of the public treasury. It will then be time for our faithful Irish people to give up their grog shops in order to become the judges and governors of the land." This wasn't a random meeting. Archbishop John Hughes, the Irish-American Bishop of New York, who Chiniquy mentioned in his book, turned his diocese into a political machine titled the Powerhouse. And no senator running for president dares to avoid the Catholic vote, where New York always seemed to be the base where the high echelons in media, business, and government gather at the famous Al Smith dinner. The top senators know if they don't attend, even though flush with gazillions in funds by big donors, they will not enter the White House without the Catholic vote.
Your Eminence Cardinal Dolan, Mr. President, Governor Cuomo, Mayor Bloomberg, Senator Schumer, Al and Ann Smith, thank you for your invitation. Thank you for your extraordinarily warm welcome. Ann and I appreciate your friendship very, very much. Thank you.
Thank you to Al and Nan, to your eminence, Governor, Ms. Romney, Governor Cuomo, Mayor Bloomberg, Senator Schumer, all the distinguished guests who are here.
Michael P. McGivney was an Irish-American Jesuit-educated priest who founded one of the most powerful organizations, the Knights of Columbus. This mega rich Catholic organization has put some of the most powerful men into office. As a previous study showed, one of them was the head of the Supreme Knight of the Knights of Columbus, Francis Matthews, who was the head of the U.S. Navy. But another Knight of Columbus climbed to the highest position in the land, the President.
On our commitment to build a strong country in a free world.
Knight of Columbus John Fitzgerald Kennedy, now a senator from Massachusetts, is on the political rise.
He received the Supreme Knight of the Knights of Columbus in the Oval Office at one point during his administration. Was presented with a plaque with the Pledge of Allegiance on it. When Luke Hart walked into the room, he got up from his desk and he said, "Hello, Chief."
John Fitzgerald Kennedy, a Knight of Columbus, as can be seen in this picture on May the 30th, 1954, at a Knight of Columbus ceremony. And prior to him becoming president, he had to struggle with the Protestants believing that him becoming president was the Vatican's grand plan of overtaking Protestant America.
For our concern is the fact that your church has stated that it has the privilege and the right and the responsibility to direct its members in various areas of life, including the political realm.
But if this election is decided on the basis that 40 million Americans lost their chance of being president on the day they were baptized, then it is the whole nation that will be the loser in the eyes of history.
And he also had to struggle with Catholic bishops saying he was too American and liberal and not Catholic enough. There are many who believe that John F. Kennedy was taken out by a secret alliance of the hierarchy of the Vatican and the inner workings of the invisible government in the US intelligence. But as facts are hard to come by, being one of the most cleverly covered up assassinations, we will really only know on the Day of Judgment. It was an Irish-American Catholic, William Donovan, who was a godfather of US intelligence. He was made by Pope Pius XII a Knight Grand Cross of the Order of St. Sylvester, the oldest and most prized of papal decorations, for setting up the Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner to the CIA that he also helped to build up. And that Catholic Irish-American element still continues to this very day, where John Brennan, the current head of the CIA, is a Jesuit-educated Irish-American Catholic. John Boehner, the 61st Speaker of the United States House of Representatives, is also a Jesuit-educated Catholic of Irish ancestry, who has not only invited the current Jesuit Pope, Francis I, to speak at Congress, but he nominated the Irish-American Jesuit priest Patrick J. Conroy as the 60th chaplain of the House of Representatives. And if you just carefully look at the most influential men in the US government, John Kerry, the current Secretary of State, a Jesuit-educated Irish-American Catholic, and Joe Biden, the first Roman Catholic Vice President of the United States, is also an Irish-American Catholic. But what about the 44th President, Barack Hussein Obama? He is seen as the first black president, where both left and right wingers are enraged at his surveillance and drone policies. And North America, a nation obsessed with race, believe that a black man has brought their country to ruins. But very few have observed that he is actually half white, whose roots can be traced on his mother's side to guess where? Ireland.
Yeah, the first time Michelle and I visited this island was about 2 years ago. We were honored to join tens of thousands on College Green in Dublin, We traveled to the little village of Moneygall, where, as it turned out, my great-great-great-grandfather was born. And I actually identified this individual in this place only a few years ago.
The bishop's plan of flooding North America with the Irish was so successful that even the English accent of North America is Irish. Listen carefully.
The time before, that's when I was actually more nervous, believe it or not, because I felt the burden of getting to know my brother cardinals better.
Time will heal, they say. The years just get heavier. Nobody tells you that.
The man shot my brother 3 times in the head. The man is having the life of Riley. Do I shake his hand or do I kill him?
But North America is at a crisis about its own culture.
Our nation's combined student loan debt has now hit $1 trillion.
College tuition has increased more than any other good or service in the entire U.S. economy.
If I do ever have kids, my private loans will be directly passed to them, even if I die. It's a nightmare.
The government will make $184 billion off our kids trying to get an education.
Colleges have turned into these large businesses.
It's a feeding frenzy to outbuild your rivals.
It created a race.
Those students are in debt and will continue to be in debt as long as every industry is profit-based. There is a part of American culture that is under siege. It is their own history. Research by the National Association of Scholars of the U.S. News and World Report's annual listing of America's best colleges, including both private and public, disclose startling figures. Most colleges today are turning out graduates who have studied little or no history. In 1914, 90% of America's elite colleges required history. In 1939 and 1964, more than 50% did. By 1996, only one of the best colleges offered a required history course. This has been seconded and verified by investigative journalist Michael Parenti, where he records in his well-researched book, Make-Believe Media, The Politics of Entertainment, that America does not even know their own past. He said, Americans are among the most ignorant people in the world when it comes to history. Americans themselves are not totally to blame for this. They are taught almost nothing of these things in primary and secondary schools, nor even at the university level. Though America is a land that has attempted to uphold the freedoms in the amendment in the Bill of Rights, there is another part of its history that is very dark, and the chroniclers of the past have left out its sensitive accounts out of the history books, for its sensitive nature can reopen wounds that have never really been properly healed. Europeans were not the only immigrants to the New World. They brought another race with them, not by choice, but by force. And their forced labor was the single largest financial asset in the entire American economy. And the slavery of black Africans was worth more than all manufacturing, all railroad, steamship lines, and other transportation systems put together.
And that servant that don't obey his Lord shall be beaten with many stripes.
That's scripture.
The condition of your laborers, it's all wrong.
They're my property.
You say that with pride.
I say it as fact.
Man does how he pleases with his property.
Slave masters misquoted the scriptures to justify brutalizing and dehumanizing black people. But what does the Bible actually say about slavery and race? Let us first look at race. The British Museum houses probably the highest number of biblical artifacts that includes not only inscriptions, but actual carvings of different biblical kings of different races of the 3 continents of Asia, Europe, and Africa. The man born Caius Octavius, but better known as Caesar Augustus, is one of the most famous European kings who is mentioned in the New Testament in Luke chapter 2 and verse 1. He founded the Roman Empire. In ancient Iraq, situated in Western Asia, the 8th century BC Assyrian monarch Tiglath-Pileser is mentioned 3 times in the Bible and is known as one of the greatest military captains in world history. In the Sudan in North Africa was born the 8th century BC King Taharka, king of Ethiopia, who is mentioned twice in the Bible for forming an alliance with the 12th king of Judah, Hezekiah, to defeat the Assyrian king Sennacherib. He ruled the 25th dynasty of Egypt and was also called Pharaoh, king of Egypt, by the Assyrian monarch. All 3 of these men were descendants of the sons of Noah: Taharka from Ham, Caesar from Japheth, and Tiglath-Pileser from Shem. George Rawlinson was the Camden Professor of Ancient History at the University of Oxford, and was one of those rare 19th century Western intellectuals who could carefully document and analyze race without a deeply ingrained Western bias. He produced a map that recorded where the sons of Noah dispersed after the flood, which is known as the Toldoth Beni Noah, or the generations of the sons of Noah, in Genesis chapter 10. In this rare-to-find book titled The Origin of Nations, George Rawlinson recorded the oldest documented account of the races of mankind. The object of the author of the 10th chapter of Genesis was to give us not a personal genealogy, but a sketch of the interconnection of races. Shem, Ham, and Japheth are no doubt persons, the actual sons of the patriarch Noah. The document is, in fact, the earliest ethnographical essay that has come down to our times. In a world that makes so much efforts to divide people by race and ethnicity, how does God analyze the whole of mankind? For the Lord seeth not as man seeth, for man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart. The Holy Scriptures is clear that all races that spread over the entire earth are the sons of Adam, who all have the same red blood. When the Most High divided to the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. And the Apostle Paul on Mars Hill confirmed this when he said, "And hath made of one blood all nations of men to dwell on the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed, and the bounds of their habitation." Ethnologists and their research on different races verifies what the Holy Scripture says. The color of the skin is due to a variety of pigments, of which melanin, a tyrosine derivative, is the most important. It is said that racial differences in skin, hair, and eye color are due entirely to the amount of melanin present, and that there is no qualitative difference in skin pigmentation of different races. All the nations that cover the earth, from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere, in the hot jungles of the Amazon in Brazil to the cold plains of Siberia, from the dark races of the Sudan to the pale race of the Caucasus Mountains, no matter what complexion, whether one has blue or brown eyes, every nation on earth is a different shade of brown or melanin. The only people who lack it are albinos. But what makes a race distinct? Are there unique features and traits that distinguishes one race from another? This attractive young woman looks like she has African features, but has long Asiatic hair. But what would one classify her as? She is from Tupinamba, one of the pre-Columbian indigenous tribes of Brazil. This woman is from Russia, a region classed as Eurasia, and she would be racially classified as Slavic or Finnish. But as you spread further out into Russia, you start to see the features change and the women start to look Eurasian. And the further you spread, the features start to look what anthropologists call Mongoloid, who are usually distinguished by their feline eyes and a yellowy looking skin complexion. But if you go to the Kalahari Desert in South Africa, the Bosawara, who the Western world calls the Bushmen, also have a yellowy looking skin and feline looking eyes. But unlike the men from Asia whose hair is straight, theirs is curly and woolly. If you were to take a trip from South Africa to an island country in the Indian Ocean off the coast of Southeast Africa called Madagascar, you would see a people who have a fusion of Africa and Asia. For some look strongly Asian and others look African, but with an ethnic mix of both. And it would be difficult to know how to racially classify them. In God's eyes, they are the sons of Adam with one red blood. In this advertisement from the Bank of America, this corporation presents itself as a multicultural melting pot, presenting America as a cultural fusion of different nationalities. National Geographic magazine did a study on multiracial North America. This woman is half Dominican and half Korean, a mixture of Africa and Asia, but you wouldn't know what race she is. This man is half Jewish and half Eskimo or Inuit, but you would not know what race he is. This woman is, guess what? Half Mexican and half Saudi Arabian. And no matter what box she may have to tick, she is just a different shade of melanin. Even if men like the incarcerated Jamaican dancehall artist Vybz Kartel bleaches his skin to look more lighter, and even when the famous Bollywood actor Shah Rukh Khan promotes the skin lightening cream Fair and Handsome in a film industry and culture obsessed with light skin, all the races, whether some feel inferior or superior to others, are just different shades of brown. But the European slave owners believed that there was a major distinction of races. But what does the Bible say about racial and cultural integration and marginalizing different ethnic groups? The Bible says that at that time you were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel and strangers from the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, ye, or all of you in Ephesus, who sometimes were far off, are made nigh or drawn nearer by the blood of Christ. For he is our peace, who hath made both one or united us, and hath broken down the middle wall of partition between us. For those who may not understand the English language of the King James Bible, breaking down the middle wall of partition was Jesus breaking down a huge gulf or barrier between the Jews and the Gentiles to unite all races into one via the gospel. For the promise God made to the first post-flood patriarch Abraham was this: and I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed. But how and through what means would all the nations be blessed? There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, for ye are all one in Christ Jesus. And if ye be Christ, then are ye Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. So the blessings of Abraham come through Christ, and Jesus is our example when he broke down the middle wall of partition when he not only spoke to the Gentile Roman soldier and healed his servant from sickness, and the Gentile the Syrophoenician and cast out the devil out of her daughter, but he did a parable about the Good Samaritan, a nation who were despised and hated by the Jews, and he also broke down racial barriers and ethnic hostilities by speaking to a Samaritan woman. There cometh a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus saith unto her, Give me to drink. Then saith the woman of Samaria unto him, How is it that thou, being a Jew, askest drink of me, which am a woman of Samaria? For the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans. The gospel was designed to break down racial and cultural barriers. When Jesus said, Go ye therefore and teach, not enslave, but teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. But it was still very hard for some of the disciples to break down their cultural and racial stereotypes. So God had to give Peter a vision to teach him to trust or treat non-Jews as fellow believers. And then Peter confessed that God taught him to break down racial barriers. And when there had been much disputing, Peter rose up and said unto them, Men and brethren, ye know that a good while ago God made choice among us, that the Gentiles by my mouth should hear the word of the gospel and believe. And God which knoweth the hearts bare them witness, giving them the Holy Ghost even as he did unto us, and put no difference between us and them, purifying their hearts by faith. So how did men justify brutalizing blacks, where they were despised, dehumanized, ghettoized, demonized, Jim Crowed, and treated lower than animals? For there are people in many different races who believe that the Bible endorses slavery. And the text the slave masters and modern bitter secular critics misquote and take out of context is Exodus chapter 21 verses 1 to 11, which is not talking about a slave in the modern context, but a servant. First, let us see how Jesus said we must treat people when we are evangelizing. And into whatsoever city or town you shall enter, inquire who in it is worthy, and there abide till you go thence, or stay there until you are about to leave. And whosoever shall not receive you, nor hear your words, when you depart out of that house or city, shake off the dust of your feet. Did Jesus endorse forcing people through an inquisition, the Crusades, or slavery? Nope, not at all. So how does the New Testament instruct how servants should be treated? Paul said, Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in singleness of your heart as unto Christ. But then the Apostle Paul instructs the masters to treat their servants with respect, for it will please God. Masters, give unto your servants that which is just and equal, knowing that ye also have a master in heaven. Paul wrote to a fellow laborer about a servant Onesimus who ran away from his master, and Paul said to Philemon how he must be treated. Not now a servant, but above a servant, a brother beloved, specially to me, but how much more unto thee, both in the flesh and in the Lord. Matthew Henry, the English Presbyterian minister, whose works are an asset, gives the best commentary in this small epistle to Philemon concerning Onesimus' treatment and well-being as a servant. Philemon, one of note and probably a minister in the church of Colossus, had a servant named Onesimus, who, having purloined his goods, ran away from him, and in his rumbles came to Rome, where Paul was then a prisoner for the gospel, and providentially coming under his preaching, there was, by the blessing of God, converted by him, after which he ministered a while to the apostle in bonds, and might have been further useful to him. But understanding him to be another man's servant, Paul would not, without his consent, detain him, but sends him back with this letter commendatory, wherein he earnestly sues for his pardon and kind reception. This is the biblical position on slavery and on race. We are all the sons of Adam and of one red blood. But what happens when these biblical counsels are ignored? We shall see in the rest of this study. These Biafrans are dancing in protest in London's Trafalgar Square. The narrator discovered from speaking to one of them that a British Army general incorporated Biafra into Nigeria in 1914. And now at the 100th year anniversary of the start of the First World War, they want their independence. Africa still struggles from the aftermath of colonialism. But what was the African continent like when Europeans explored it during the 15th to 17th century, before many of its indigenous inhabitants migrated without their consent? In a rare-to-find book titled The Christian Philosopher, a brilliant thesis on science from a biblical perspective, Thomas Dick, a 19th century Scottish scientist and church minister, documented the vast number of kingdoms in Africa. Africa comprehends the following kingdoms: Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, Egypt, Zara, Negroland, Guinea, Nubia, Abyssinia, Kaffraria, Dahomey, Benin, Congo, Angola, and various other territories. In museums around Europe are artifacts from the Benin Empire in Nigeria, West Africa. What is very interesting about the artwork that consists of bronze and ivory is that it shows a high level of sophistication and skill, from bracelets made from ivory to brilliant facial caricatures of bronze. When the British Museum did an exhibition in 2010 on its artwork, the commentary about its art in the British press contradicted preconceived ideas about African culture. Detailed sculptures showing African civilization was as sophisticated as anything in the West during the Middle Ages go on display in London. The major highlights date from the 13th to 15th century. The small display astonished visitors who could scarcely believe the works were from Africa, nor that they were so old. The former Francophone colony, Mali, in West Africa, is considered as one of the poorest countries in the world. It is suffering from a horrific war where French troops came in to apparently protect the country from Al-Qaeda jihadists. But anyone knows that whenever there is Western intervention, there are natural resources. For Mali is believed to have significant oil and gas reserves. But it wasn't always poor. On a website called Celebrity Net Worth that documents the 25 richest people who have ever lived, as you scroll down, you will see US billionaire Warren Buffett. But at number 4 is the Scottish-American billionaire steel magnate Andrew Carnegie. At number 3 is oil tycoon and US billionaire, the richest American who ever lived, John D. Rockefeller Sr. At number 2 is the ridiculously rich Rothschild family. But at number 1 is the billionaire Mansa Musa. Who is he? In the video game Sid Meier's Civilization 4 that chronicles world civilizations, one of the kings that you can pick from is Mansa Musa, the wealthy black African billionaire king of Mali. The oldest image of him is from Catalan Atlas, a medieval map that was compiled by Jewish book illuminator Abraham Kresk. And in his hand is the precious metal that made him wealthy, the gold nugget, where he is adorned in royal attire with a scepter in his hand and a crown on his head. The title Mansa translates as King of Kings, and Musa is the Arabic pronunciation of Moses, King Moses, where he was titled, as the Catalan map says, the Lord of the Negroes of Guinea. He was in charge of an empire that had one of the world's most famous cities, Timbuktu, the capital of Mali, once considered as the lost city of gold. It was a transit point and financial center for trade across the Sahara, and it is considered to have the oldest university in the world, with manuscript libraries some decades before Oxford and Cambridge in England that number in its hundreds of thousands. The majority of the manuscripts are written in Arabic, for Timbuktu was a fusion of African and Arabic culture, where men from all over came to study astronomy, mathematics, history, medicine, and personal hygiene. A place of 25,000 scholars, from the 13th century it was once the center of the seat of learning. From West Africa through the Sahara, we go into the Horn of Africa, a country once called Abyssinia, known today as Ethiopia, a name the Greeks once gave to the whole of Africa and its people. The 4th century King Ezana turned Ethiopia officially into a Christian nation, which has one of the oldest Christian communities on earth, and successive kings such as the 13th century medieval emperor Yuko Amla retained that Christian culture as well as his successors. In probably one of the best works on the history of Christianity, titled Moshim's Ecclesiastical History, in Volume 3, John Lorenz von Moschim, the German Lutheran historian, tells us that the Armenian Church, Syrian Church, Coptic Church of Egypt, and Ethiopian Church were all separate from Rome. Vardapet Mesrop Mashtot, the Armenian theologian, linguist, and hymnologist, invented the Armenian alphabet, and when the first monument of Armenian literature, the Bible, was presented to the people, when carefully analyzing the script is strikingly identical to the Ethiopian liturgical language in their Bible, Ge'ez. For many scholars believed that the 5th century Armenian alphabet was copied from the Ethiopians. The Ethiopian Bibles are translated from the Syriac text, known as the Textus Receptus or the Peshitta, the simple or common version. And unlike most of modern-day Bible translations that come from the Vaticanus or Sinaiticus, even the King James Version is also from the Peshitta. King Lalibela, who ruled in the early 13th century, built a number of churches, 11 in total. They are known as the Rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, and they are built out of solid rock, still standing the test of time after 8 centuries, whose engineering and architectural mastery is fascinating. They are protected under the UNESCO World Heritage Site by the General Assembly of the United Nations. Bet Medhein Alem is the largest monolithic rock-hewn church in the world, and being a landlocked country, Ethiopia was able to retain its apostolic culture without being contaminated by any outside forces. In one of the best documented works on European history, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Edward Gibbon, the 18th century English historian and Member of Parliament, documented Ethiopia's uniqueness due to its isolation. Christianity was more deeply rooted in the Abyssinian Empire. Encompassed on all sides by the enemies of their religion, the Ethiopians slept near 1,000 years, forgetful of the world by whom they were forgotten. but there was one system who seeked her out and tried to subdue her under her control. The first kingdom in Revelation chapter 13, the Papacy. The sons of Loyola, the Jesuits, had Ethiopia under their radar as a part of their plan for papal world domination. This painting that shows the founding of the Jesuits in 1540 shows Ignatius de Loyola, its founder, on his knees handing Pope Paul III his mystical theology, the spiritual exercises, the modern spiritual formation. And the man standing behind the throne of the Pope is an Ethiopian monk, Pedro, who Ignatius had regular correspondence with. Abba Gregorius Ethiops visited Rome, and the Jesuits learned a lot from him about Ethiopia. And being meticulous chroniclers, the Jesuits documented everything about Ethiopian monophysite Christianity. The late Philip Carman, an English Jesuit priest, recorded the practices of the Ethiopian Church, and when the narrator read it in Philip Carman's book, The Lost Empire, the Story of the Jesuits in Ethiopia, it had striking similarities to the customs of his own church. Ethiopian Christians detest smoking. Abstinence from pork, hair, and non-scaly fish, and the holiness of the Sabbath. On the Sabbath, hunting, fishing, and traveling were forbidden, and no work was done in the fields. You can see the type of architecture the Ethiopians had when they were separated for 1,000 years. This is from the Aksum era. But when the Jesuits came, they introduced their form of architecture, and you can see the Portuguese influence in the palace of this Ethiopian king. And the Vatican and her Jesuit priests had a short-lived plan to convert the whole nation from biblical Orthodox Christianity to papal bureaucracy. Philip Carman said how they influenced the Ethiopian emperor. Tsar Dengel, the emperor, published a proclamation ordering Sunday, not the Jewish Sabbath, to be kept as a holy day after the Roman manner. So when the Jesuits controlled the Ethiopian Empire, they tried to impose the Roman Catholic Sunday and replace the biblical Sabbath, which the Ethiopians kept. But the Ethiopians were not impressed one bit with Roman Catholicism and the Jesuit autocratic style of government, and it was not long before an uprising took place in that 16th century African empire. In Volume 2 of the 3-volume set, The History of Protestantism, the prolific 19th century historian and writer James Aitken Wiley recorded what the Jesuits attempted to do and how they were eventually kicked out of Ethiopia. Don Inigo Lopez de Recalde, the Ignatius Loyola of history, was the founder of the Order of Jesus, or the Jesuits. They attempt to plant the popish faith and establish their own dominion in Abyssinia. One of the pioneers, Ovida, who had entered Ethiopia, wrote thus to the Pope: "He must be permitted to inform His Holiness that, with the assistance of 500 or 600 Portuguese soldiers, he could at any time reduce the Emperor of Abyssinia to the obedience of the pontificate." The Emperor of Ethiopia was gained by flatteries and miracles. A terrible persecution was raised against the native Christians. Thousands were massacred, but at last the king, having detected the authors of these barbarities plotting against his own life and the throne, they were ignominiously expelled the country. This is what Africa was like when the Europeans came. Highly advanced cultures, brilliant artwork, and highly advanced architecture, and Ethiopia was one of the few cultures that escaped the wrath of Western imperialism, but it wasn't totally innocent. Slavery already existed in Africa prior to Europeans' arrival, and this picture shows an Ethiopian king trading slaves with Arabs. Islam is usually overlooked when describing the enforced traffic on black Africans. Till this very day, the Arab-dominated culture of Islam still practices slavery on blacks. in the Arab-dominated West African country called Mauritania, slavery was officially abolished in 1983, but it still continues to this very day. And on the website titled Global Slavery, out of the 162 countries, it ranks as number 1, the leading country on earth that still continues in slavery. Muslims have been among the most ferocious slavers in history. The Islamic trade, unlike the Atlantic trade, had begun some 8 centuries earlier. Black slavery in Islam, a phenomenon deplorably not yet at an end, but with a paradox of a black diaspora whose very existence is denied, though it survives in substantial numbers. When the African-American Muslim convert and civil rights activist Malcolm X visited Crown Prince Faisal Al Saud in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, he was so blinded by this fictitious picture of a colorless Islamic brotherhood that he didn't even see that blacks were being used and enslaved throughout the Arab world, and the Saudi kingdom and its monarchy held an estimated 500,000 slaves, where in countries like Iraq and Yemen, blacks are still called Abd Allah, the slave of Allah. From this 13th century painting in Yemen, you can see that Arab Muslims were trading in blacks from very early, and it is very difficult to collate the horrors of Islamic slavery. For unlike the Western world, despite its own horrors, they have at least museums, TV documentaries, films, memorials, textbooks, lectures and debates, and Europeans have carefully documented everything. Islam makes no mention of it at all, and her scant documentation are in several languages across libraries in the Muslim world. It is vital to record Islam's unending role in the slavery of blacks, for they were the ones who taught the Europeans, where the Portuguese traded with the Arabs. Black Islamic states also played a role in this evil traffic that also included the previously mentioned Timbuktu in Mali. And even other non-Islamic black African countries played a role and made a profit from kidnapping and selling their own people and selling them to both Arabs and Europeans, which is why many blacks in the Caribbean, the Americas, and Europe take offense when people call them Africans. But how many of the African countries were men and women taken out from and treated not as servants as the Holy Scriptures divinely instructs, but forced labor and property? The account of many ex-slaves gives us a picture. In central London, on a road called Riding House Street, what is now a medical school was once the home of an ex-slave, and his name was on a plaque on the top left. His name, Olaudah Equiano. And it is in this house where he wrote his autobiography of his experience in slavery, where he confirmed that he is an Igbo, one of the 4 main tribes from Nigeria. This book in a London museum has a picture of Job ben Solomon on the left and William Ansa on the right, 2 former slaves who lived in England. Job ben Solomon was from the Gambia. The son of a Muslim high priest, he sold his fellow blacks as slaves, but he was then kidnapped and sold into slavery, but he eventually purchased his freedom. William Ansa was from Ghana, the son of a prestigious ruler. He also profited in selling black slaves, but was also sold into slavery, but he, like Job ben Solomon, was eventually set free. The man known as the Black Napoleon, Toussaint Louverture, was born in Haiti, but was from the Dahomey in Benin. He led out in the Haiti Revolution against France. Jean-Baptiste Belly was born in Senegal and was taken as a slave when he was 2 years old to Haiti. He eventually was freed, and during the French Revolution, he became a member of the National Convention. Jack Driver was a slave born in Guinea who worked on a South Carolina plantation, and this photo was taken in 1850. And on the same plantation in the same year, another slave called Renty was from the Congo. And this was the high number of countries in Africa where people were used as property. For even after slavery was abolished, the Western slaveholding nations still used blacks for their livelihoods. This photo, dated to 1908, has a southern cotton planter in West Point, Mississippi, with his dogs and gun, and with men, women and children living in pretty much the same conditions as when slavery was legal 43 years earlier. In this photo, dated to the mid-19th century, it shows a plantation owner in Jamaica in the Caribbean, then a British colony, standing on the far right with his workers in the sugarcane field, though slavery was officially abolished throughout the British Empire in 1833. This photo shows slaves at a coffee yard in a farm in Brazil in South America in 1882, with the owner standing on the far left directing the slaves. Brazil was entirely built on the back of the largest forced migration in history, and while everyone is aware that America was economically built on forced slave labor of black Africans, very few are aware that Brazil became the largest slave-owning country that received 10 times as many Africans as North America. It has the second largest black population in the world after Nigeria, and it was the last country in the Americas to officially abolish slavery that didn't take place until 1888. You can still see the tribal scars on this man's face that shows how fresh he was from Africa. Brazil doesn't like to talk about slavery. Instead, it catapults its mixed African and Portuguese beauties in fashion, and venerates its World Cup heroes who are also of African and Portuguese heritage, to pretend that nothing has happened and everything is all now equal. But Brazil, a Portuguese colony as a result of the Pope's line, was dominated by a European power that controlled every aspect of its culture. This system started the traffic in black Africans in Europe, and it also tried to fight the abolition of it, and it has got off too lightly. It is the papacy. And when the Bible prophesied its spiritual decline, it logs the thing that made it economically profitable: the merchandise of gold and slaves and souls of men. The late Avram Manhattan was a secular investigative journalist, the world-renowned authority on Roman Catholicism in the 20th century. He was born in Italy but spent most of his life in England, where he worked for the British intelligence during the Second World War. Today, most journalists, preachers, politicians, NGOs and governments are scared to challenge the papacy. But Avram Manhattan was fearless, and being a student of the London School of Economics, he knew how the papacy worked and the threat she posed to the liberty of mankind, including the liberty of slaves. The Catholic Church opposed the abolition of slavery, example in Brazil, where during the Latin American revolutions there exists the largest slave class in America, over 1/2 of the 7 million inhabitants being slaves, a good portion of them owned by the church. When the Brazilian parliament in the last century abolished slavery, the church denounced the promoters of the bill with the bitterest venom. Indeed, she went so far as to help in the downfall of the Emperor of Brazil on the ground that he was one of its main advocates. The Catholic Church has not only persistently opposed the abolition of slavery, but sanctioned slavery. A papal bull in 1537 sanctioned the opening of slave markets in Lisbon, where between 10,000 and 12,000 Negroes were sold each year for transportation to American colonies. The popes approved slavery in Portugal as late as 1837. No pope issued encyclicals condemning slavery until 1871, when slavery had been abolished practically throughout the civilized nations. Even less did they promote mighty crusades to free slaves and thus abolish one of the most unchristian institutions of Christendom, as they did against the American colonies, against the liberals of the 19th century and against the communists of the 20th. On the contrary, the abolition of slavery was initiated by Protestants, liberals and Democrats. It never came from the Vatican, which opposed it with the utmost stubbornness. Example, when the various governments of Europe attempted to sign an international agreement among themselves to render slavery illegal. The artwork from the Benin Empire shows the Portuguese and its early role of penetration into the African continent, where the priests are alongside their soldiers. The Spanish Empire was controlled by King Charles V, who was also ruler of the Holy Roman Empire and the head of the Habsburg dynasty. he granted the first license to sell Africans in the Spanish colonies of America, and this is when the West African slave trade began. It was endorsed by Bartolomé de las Casas, the 16th century Spanish Dominican friar who believed that the slavery of black Africans would preserve the natives of the Caribbean who were being wiped out in their numbers, experiencing an horrific Holocaust. The Spanish also temporarily had an influence in North America, as shown previously in the study. And the Roman Catholic encyclopedias open that the Catholic Church was the first to introduce slavery into North America. Lucas Vasquez de Ayllón, the Spanish discoverer of Chesapeake Bay, received from Charles V a grant of the land he discovered, and in 1526 founded the settlement of San Miguel de Grandab, not far from the site of the city of Jamestown, built by the English, and fully 80 years later. The employment of Negro slaves in this work is perhaps the first instance of Negro slave labor within the territory of the United States. But though the Catholic French and the Protestant Dutch played a role, it was the English who dominated the slave trade, and all classes in English society endorsed it, from the government and public opinion to the church, where the Church of England not only endorsed it, but received a financial cut from the monopoly of the trade. Queen Elizabeth I, the Tudor monarch whose statue is carved into the architecture of London's Harrow School, first opposed slavery, but then had a change of mind and endorsed it. It was Admiral Sir John Hawkins, the English shipbuilder, merchant, pirate, naval administrator and commander who led the first English slave trading expedition in 1562 that started the English slave trade. His very crest was a bound slave in ropes where he kidnapped 400 black Africans from Guinea. In London's National Archives in Kew are documents that gives us a picture how dependent England and the West were on slavery. In the Calendar of State Papers, Colonial Series in America and the West Indies, dated to the 17th century, there is a letter from Renatus Innes to Sir Henry Bennet that says, "Were the planters supplied with," and look at the words the narrator has highlighted, "Negroes, the strength and sinews of this Western world, they would advance their fortunes and His Majesty's customs." In an area of London called Canary Wharf, a place that is like a city within a city with its own security to monitor the area, there is a reason why the Economist said that London is by many measures the world's biggest financial center. For Canary Wharf is flooded with all the top banks in the United States and the United Kingdom. For many are unaware that English banking developed as a result of slavery, and that the Bank of England in London's famous Square Mile was central to the wealth of its bankers like Humphrey Maurice, who acquired a vast amount of his wealth from slavery. The bank that might justly have been called the Bank of the West Indies in the 18th century was the Bank of England. Black slavery augmented in one way or another the family fortunes of many of its directors and governors. Humphrey Maurice, MP, director of the bank from 1716, deputy governor in 1725-6, and governor in 1727-9, personally owned 6 slave ships. But what role did the churches play in banking? On London's Euston Road is the headquarters of the Society of Friends, better known as the Quakers, a very caring, peace-loving church community. In a previous study, it was shown that in North America, the Quakers suffered a lot of persecution under the Puritan-dominated government. Some were whipped, others were killed. The most famous Quaker was William Penn, who got permission from King Charles II to acquire the land named after his family, Pennsylvania, a separate Quaker colony to avoid persecution. But what was the Quakers' stance on slavery? John Woolman, an English Quaker, went throughout the United States condemning the evils of slavery and wrote a booklet that he wanted all the denominations to read to stop it at once. James Naylor, one of the founding Quakers, was also an abolitionist, who condemned it throughout the British Isles. But the United States Quakers were not innocent at all. In a book titled In His Image, Racism in Southern Religion, it documents the Quakers' profits from slavery. The Society of Friends was the pioneering anti-slavery church in America. Nevertheless, it must be noted that up until the eve of the American Revolution, many, if not most, of the prosperous Friends in all the colonies still held slaves. Unlike churchmen in most of the other denominations, Quakers did not publish pamphlets or sermons in support of slavery, but the fact that they brought and kept Negroes spoke more loudly than the printed word. Since Pennsylvania was Quaker ruled throughout the first half of the 18th century, its sentiment on slavery was seen to be representative of Quakerism in general. In any case, William Penn, founder of the Holy Experiment on the Delaware, was still a slave owner at his death in 1718. During the first third of the century, Philadelphia's Quaker merchants were busily engaged in importing and selling West India blacks, and some of them persisted in that trade well into the 1750s. But they also held a monopoly in banking. The insignia of the black horse is the iconic symbol of the British retail bank, Lloyd's Bank. It was founded by the English Quaker, Birmingham banker Sampson Lloyd II, who founded it in 1756, and it was developed and profited as a result of the slave trade. In a British newspaper, the London Times, it documents that African Americans are planning to sue Lloyd's Bank for compensation for the ships used in the slave trade. In Canary Wharf in No. 1 Church Place is the headquarters of the British multinational and banking services Barclays Bank. It was founded by Quakers John Freem and Thomas Gould in 1690. But the man whose name it bears today is the English Quaker merchant and banker, David Barclay, a close friend of the US founding father, Benjamin Franklin. And these Quakers kept their monopoly inside their own circles, where they profited handsomely from the slave trade. David Barclay, American merchant, banker, and brewer. He married secondly in 1767 Rachel Lloyd, daughter of Sampson Lloyd of Birmingham. He entered his father's firm of American merchants and was also involved in his banking interests. Following the death of his father, he became a partner in the bank, the firm then styled Barclay, Bevan, and Benning. But the Quakers make no mention of their involvement in slavery. In 1756, there were 84 Quakers listed as members of the company trading to Africa, among them the Barclay and Baring families. Slave dealing was one of the most lucrative investments of English as of American Quakers. The Barclays married into the banking families of Gurney and Freem, like so many other intermarriages in other branches of industry which kept Quaker wealth in Quaker hands. Slave merchants and sugar planters' special financial needs led, in London as in Bristol and Liverpool, two close connections between these trades and the banks. Alexander and David Barclay, theirs was not yet a household name, were among the 84 Quaker slave traders in 1756.
Laws that allow us to diminish the humanity of anybody are not laws.
He speaks a voice for people who do not have one.
What an embarrassment to the name of Jesus, when the leading profiteers of banking, trade, and shipping were members of the church. Didn't any Christian boldly condemn these horrors in England? Well, there were a few. The 17th century English Puritan Richard Baxter was an articulate scholar and one of the finest men that Protestantism produced, and these were his views on slavery, which he thought was disgusting. How cursed a crime is it to equal men to beasts? Is this not your practice? Do you not buy them and use them merely as you do horses to labor for your commodity? Do you not see how you reproach and condemn yourselves while you vilify them all as savages? During the Great Awakening, the father of Methodism, John Wesley, and one of the true reformers, condemned it with no apologies, and he wrote a book on it condemning its horrors. Granville Sharp, one of the first advocates of the abolition of slavery, was a believer in the end times, but is better known as a philanthropist. He was famous for befriending a black man called James Strong, who was born in Barbados and brought to London by his master, David Lyle, where Sharp won a case for him to not be deported back to the West Indies, and he campaigned for black slaves in Britain. Robert Wedderburn was not only an abolitionist, a licensed Methodist preacher, but known as the working class hero for achieving the freedom of the press in Britain in the 19th century. Born in Jamaica to a Scottish plantation owner and his mother, a slave, he was one of the few Christians who campaigned for the abolition of slavery. In a book already quoted titled The Christian Philosopher in the 19th Century, Scottish scientist and theologian Thomas Dick also condemned slavery and was adamant that it was indeed a crime against humanity. By far the greater part of Africa remains hitherto unexplored. That most abominable traffic, the slave trade, is carried on to an unlimited extent on its western coast by a set of European ruffians whose villainies are a disgrace to human nature. It is to be hoped this traffic will, ere long, be extirpated by the efforts now making by European nations. In the history of Protestantism, the best documented work on the Reformation, when the prolific Scottish writer James Aitken Wylie, already mentioned, described the persecutions of the Waldenses and their treatment in the aftermath, he compared it to the exact treatment on blacks during slavery. All of the Waldensian race that remained from the sword of the executioners were immured in the dungeons of Piedmont. And how were they treated in prison? As the African slave was treated on the Middle Passage. Secular critics are quick to judge and lambaste religion for its complicit role in slavery. But how many secular critics condemned it? All of the European humanist intellectuals either endorsed it or wrote some evil treatise on black Africans. We can name a number of them: Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Voltaire, Immanuel Kant, Karl Linnaeus, Peter Camper, and the list goes on. But in the north of London are the buried remains of a man who had one of the biggest impacts on the 20th century, and his influence is still felt. A man whose mausoleum stands in London's Highgate Cemetery. His name is Karl Marx, praised by millions worldwide as his liberal thinker. What was this secular economist and philosopher's views on the slavery of black Africans? This is what he said. Freedom and slavery constitute an antagonism. We are not dealing with indirect slavery, the slavery of the proletariat, but with direct slavery, the slavery of the black races in Suriname, in Brazil, in the southern states of North America. Direct slavery is as much the pivot of our industrialism today as machinery, credit, etc. Without slavery, no cotton. Without cotton, no modern industry. Slavery has given value to the colonies. The colonies have created world trade. World trade is the necessary condition of large-scale machine industry. Thus, before the traffic in Negroes began, the colonies supplied the old world with only very few products and made no visible change in the face of the earth. Slavery is therefore an economic category of the highest importance. Without slavery, North America, the most progressive country, will be transformed into a patriarchal land. You have only to wipe North America of the nations and you get anarchy, the total decay of trade and of modern civilization. But to let slavery disappear is to wipe North America off the map of the nations. Karl Marx believed in the preservation of black slavery. And Karl Marx's words were endorsed when Hollywood, America's most influential storyteller in its golden age, distorted history with the 1939 American classic Gone with the Wind, which is simply a romanticism of crimes against humanity that celebrates the economic franchise of slaveocracy, portraying the South as better off when slavery was enforced, where slaveholders are portrayed as warm, lovable people, and the slaves are characterized as very uneducated, but dedicated and loyal to their masters. But America still struggles with its own past.
It would appear I can choose to do with my property whatever I so desire.
After slavery was abolished, many blacks became middle class and they prospered from the progressive culture of the United States. These were known as the Black Victorians. Many neighborhoods were built up that became economically independent, and they were called the Black Wall Street, where many blacks became rich and successful, becoming lawyers and businessmen, building up strong black communities. But there was one that became a bit too prosperous. In 1901 in Tulsa, Oklahoma, many became rich and famous overnight when an oil well was drilled, making it the oil capital of the world. Many blacks flooded into Oklahoma to reap the benefits of this oil boom, and they built up the most prosperous black neighborhood in North America. There is a memorial to its prestige and greatness, but something happened that was to turn this economically prosperous neighborhood into ashes. The worst race riot in history that hardly any Americans know about was triggered as a result of a white woman falsely accusing a black man of sexually assaulting her. Lynching was a common act in America, where black men could be lynched for the slightest thing, from even whistling at a white woman in the South's Jim Crow laws. And they even made postcards of the lynchings as a source of trophy for their killings that were distributed throughout the so-called Bible Belt in the South. But the blacks in Tulsa, Oklahoma were not going to let no lynching happen, and they went to the courthouse armed with guns. A journalist by the name of Richard Lloyd Jones regularly stoked the fire of racial hatred through his newspapers, and white males who came back from the First World War and couldn't find work were very resentful at seeing a prosperous black neighborhood just over the railroad. A little scuffle took place and a few shots were heard, and the worst race riot kicked off in 1921. Blacks tried to defend themselves, but they were outnumbered by huge armed white mobs who came into that black neighborhood and looted every house in sight before setting each one alight. And they not only invaded from the ground, they took to the air and bombed this prosperous, economically self-reliant, vibrant African-American community. They were doctors, lawyers, teachers, entrepreneurs. Some even owned their own airplanes. It had its own bus service, post office, business, several law and doctor's offices, schools, where the dollar circulated 36 to 100 times. And in one day, 34 square blocks of Tulsa's Greenwood community was reduced to smoldering rubble, including their most prized architectural achievement, Mount Zion Church. And hundreds of homes were stripped of their most precious goods, clothing, pianos, musical instruments, etc. And any black in sight, whether it was man, woman or child, was shot dead. By the time the National Guard came, it was too late. But the blacks knew why such rage was vented on a community that was nicknamed Little Africa and the Black Wall Street. It is one of the most covered up episodes of US history, and the narrator only was made aware of it by a colleague in April 2014. But there is a book that records in detail this dark side of US history that is still available on Amazon.com. Many progressives want to move forward from the many embarrassing episodes of US history, but there are others who still like to stoke the flames of racial division using the most right-wing propaganda news channel, Fox.
Changing country, the demographics are changing. It's not a traditional America anymore. And whereby 20 years ago, President Obama would have been roundly defeated by an establishment candidate like Mitt Romney. The white establishment is now the minority. You're going to see a tremendous Hispanic vote for President Obama, overwhelming black vote for President Obama, and women will probably break President Obama's way. People feel that they are entitled to things, and which candidate between the two is going to give them things.
Bill O'Reilly is an Irish-American Catholic who suffers from deep amnesia. He either ignores or is unaware that the Irish were once seen as immigrants who were a burden to the Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture. But this wasn't the first time an influential child of the papacy took that stance. Just before the US Civil War, Dred Scott, an African-American slave from Missouri, wanted to sue to gain his freedom, and he took his case to court. It was one of the most racially contested cases in North American history, and the judge who oversaw the case was the highest judge in the land, the Roman Catholic Chief Justice of the US Supreme Court, Roger B. Taney, who said that Scott had no right to sue in a federal court because neither free blacks nor slaves were citizens of the United States. And he is on record as saying at the trial, the authors of the Constitution had viewed all blacks as being of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. During the American War of Independence in the late 18th century, and during the American Civil War from 1861 to 1865, which many believe it was solely over the issue of slavery, but it was really a conflict between northern industrialization and the southern planter, or a move from agrarianism to industrialization. What was the church's position on slavery? Only a few unsung heroes made a stand.
Congress must never declare equal those whom God created unequal.
The 17th century English Protestant theologian is America's true founding father, who had to flee for his life while advocating freedom for others. Roger Williams not only condemned the Puritans for their unchristlike bully tactics, but he condemned them for their ungodly mistreatment of Native Americans and the horrible mistreatment of blacks as slaves. The 18th century Baptist preacher Isaac Backus, who single-handedly had one of the greatest influence on the Bill of Rights, not only condemned religious state tyranny, but condemned the evil trade of the forced labor of black Africans. In the 19th century, William Lloyd Garrison was one of the few bold Christians who made a stand and led out in the abolition movement in North America. And to make his movement stronger, he appointed Frederick Douglass, a runaway slave whose first-hand account of the horrors of slavery were to haunt him for life, where with his first wife they both went around the country preaching against the evils of slavery, but hoping they won't be caught and sold back. John Brown is a national hero to African Americans. He believed that William Lloyd Garrison's approach was too weak, and he believed that the only way to overthrow the evil institution of North American slavery was by an insurrection, and he led the unsuccessful Harper's Ferry raid on the Federal Armory. But it was crushed, and he was convicted and sentenced to death by hanging in the same year in 1859. And this famous painting shows how appreciated and loved he was in the black community. This book, published in 1852, was absolutely hated in the South because it hit at some hard home truths. Harriet Beecher Stowe, the daughter of a Presbyterian preacher, was appalled at the horrors of slavery. She became an abolitionist. And she published a book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and this is what she wrote. Does not every American Christian owe to the African race some effort at reparation for the wrongs that the American nation has brought upon them? Shall the doors of churches and schoolhouses be shut upon them? Shall states arise and shake them out? Shall the Church of Christ here in silence encourage the cruelty that would chase them from our borders? If it must be so, it will be a mournful spectacle. Harriet Beecher Stowe was a very rare lone voice in that age. but in a book called Slavery and Catholicism, published by the author Richard Roscoe Miller, he carefully assessed the churches that made a stand just prior to the American Civil War. It is true that other large popular denominations were unwilling to stand for principle, but were divided along the Mason and Dixon line, the so-and-so church north and the so-and-so church south. In fact, it was only a very few of the smaller sects which stood foursquare against slavery. The Quakers and the Mennonites seem to have been the only church bodies which squarely came out against the slave trade, except for the fact that the Seventh-day Adventist Church, even in its embryonic period from 1845 to 1863, denounced it most definitely and unequivocally. One of its early advocates was a man named John Nevis Andrews, who, like Harriet Beecher Stowe, gave a hard rebuke to the churches of North America. The Protestant church till within a short time held many thousand slaves, nor is the fact to be disguised that the professed church was the right arm of the slave power, nor was slavery abolished by the churches. To the secular power falls the honor of overthrowing this gigantic evil, and the churches have never confessed their great wrong in so long upholding this iniquitous system. In America, prayers for the enslaved were not allowed in the revival meetings. The Founding Fathers wrote the famous document titled the Declaration of Independence, which reads, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." A beautiful document, but the only problem is that the men who compiled it didn't put it into practice. In the video game Assassin's Creed 3, George Washington, the first president of the United States, is revered as a great statesman. But this man also kept a good number of slaves, though his signature is on the Declaration of Independence. The document doesn't seem to include slaves. The only surviving house of Benjamin Franklin is not in America, but in England, not far from Trafalgar Square Station. Ripley's Believe It or Not logs many of its firsts. He invented the rocking chair, the street lamp, the Gulf Stream, double spectacles, the lightning conductor. He was the father of modern dentistry, the first fire department, the first system of ventilation, and the list goes on. But he also was a slave owner who never condemned the system of slavery. Thomas Jefferson is the most famous of the Founding Fathers, being the principal author of the Declaration of Independence and the third President of the United States. But over in England, Thomas Day, an abolitionist, blasted Thomas Jefferson and considered him as a big old hypocrite and a man who was a plethora of contradictions, when he said, "If there be an object truly ridiculous in nature, it is an American patriot signing resolutions of independency on one hand, and with the other brandishing a whip over his affrighted slaves." Thomas Jefferson is famous for writing a book called The Notes on the State of Virginia, and it shows his true views of the very slaves he held, and this book is still in print. I advance it therefore as a suspicion only that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowments both of body and mind. This confirms what Chief Justice Taney said. But what is sad is that Jefferson witnessed with his own eyes and corresponded with one he considered as inferior, who helped to build up Washington, D.C. Very few people have heard of Benjamin Banneker. He was a free African American who was self-taught, who was a scientist, author, surveyor, mathematician, farmer, astronomer, publisher, and urban planner, who published an almanac, an annual publication that comprises of a calendar of days, weeks, and months, with the times of the rising of the sun and moon and eclipses. And what will shock people is that he helped survey the region called the District of Columbia, which today we call Washington, D.C., one of the least recorded episodes of American history. The United States of America has markers all over that records its history, and this one says that Benjamin Banneker was self-taught, he surveyed the District of Columbia, and he published the first Maryland Almanac, and was recognized by Thomas Jefferson for his achievements. Thomas Jefferson was lying, for he witnessed intellectual capabilities with his own eyes. During the most intense period of American history, with a war that was to decide its destiny, North America was still struggling to put the Declaration of Independence into practice that was signed less than 100 years ago. The Pied Piper of Hollywood, Steven Spielberg, did a 2012 film called Lincoln that starred English actor Daniel Day-Lewis as the US President Abraham Lincoln. It stuck with the US traditional storyline as Lincoln being a compassionate sympathizer of the slaves. Abraham Lincoln's statue stands in Parliament Square in London, opposite the Houses of Parliament. But in 2011, the year before the film, in London's National Archives, British researchers unearthed some shocking letters of Lincoln's. Lincoln wanted to deport the black African slaves into British colonies and was arranging it with British diplomats so that America can be a pure white state. This is an area of study that is deleted out of the history books. When the Emancipation Proclamation was passed in 1865, there was still a very big issue to tackle. The problem the European descendants had with the blacks was what to do with them now. How do you assimilate 4 million of black African descendants into the Euro-American Christian culture? How do you deal with the anger and backlash of a race of people who knew that their forced migration and labor built up the entire economic infrastructure of the United States, but who did not get any credit for it, neither were promised their 40 acres and a mule? 100 years later, in 1965, blacks officially became free citizens with the Voting Rights Act through a deadly struggle for their freedom. But within those 100 years, many of these descendants of slaves played a very powerful contribution, not only to North America, but the world. The traffic lights helped to improve road safety so that accidents can be prevented. But who invented it? And what about the gas mask, an invention that was crucial to soldiers during World War I that saved the lives of thousands of US Army soldiers? They were both invented by Garrett A. Morgan, an African-American inventor. He introduced the gas mask in 1912 and patented it in 1914, where he rescued workers from a gas-filled tunnel under Lake Erie in a tunnel disaster in 1916. In this plaque in the state of Ohio, he is credited as a prolific inventor of devices that saved people's lives. And on the opposite it reads that he made the safety hood, the forerunner of the gas mask, and the traffic signal, where he continued to make other inventions. What about the medical field? Who performed the first successful open heart surgery? It was an African-American doctor by the name of Daniel Hale Williams, who founded Providence Hospital in 1893. The Jehovah's Witnesses opposed the shedding of blood, but who created the first blood bank? During the Second World War in England, the blood supply was low and people were losing their lives rapidly. So the British Red Cross called an African-American doctor by the name of Charles Drew, who was skilled in blood plasma. He later became the director of the British Red Cross program, where he established the first blood bank in England. He studied at McGill University in Montreal, Canada, where he did experimentation with blood transfusion. He landed a job in Howard University where he taught black doctors, and while there he received a grant to study blood preservation at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital in New York, and he began to study the separation of blood components and transfusions, where he has saved millions of lives.
Where would blood banking be if it were not for Charles Drew? I don't think we'd be as advanced as we are today. Certainly much of the pioneering work of the technology that we use today was developed by Dr. Charles Drew.
Alexander Graham Bell was an American inventor famous for inventing one of the most famous devices on earth, the telephone. But who helped Bell prepare the drawings and scale models? Thomas Edison was an American inventor and businessman who developed the phonograph, the motion picture camera, and the electric light bulb that has lit up the entire planet. But who helped these two men to enhance their inventions? Lewis Latimer, an African-American inventor, who is this unknown genius and devout Christian. He worked for Thomas Edison's Menlo Park. This photo shows Thomas Edison with his cane standing in the bottom row, just above the seated man. And standing in the bottom left is Lewis Latimer, one of the greatest pioneers in the development of electricity. He was the only African-American member of the Edison Pioneers, a group of distinguished scientists and pioneers who worked for Thomas Edison. Lewis Latimer, while drafting the plans for Alexander Graham Bell, also worked for General Electric and Westinghouse. He was the one who produced and improved on the method for carbon filaments that is used in the light bulb, and he co-wrote the book Incandescent Electric Lighting that can still be purchased on Amazon.com, documenting his finds. Electric light as a factor in our civilization is becoming daily of more importance. A system of electric lighting takes the form of light through the instrumentality of the carbon filament enclosed in the glass bulb of the lamp. Being a Christian, he didn't let race get in the way of progress. And as he took that stance, he helped electrify the entire planet. But while these inventors could easily blend into white society because of their light skin, there was one who had an even greater influence than them, and he is the biggest inspiration to the narrator. If you were to look at a peanut, would you think that over 300 different products can be made from it? One man asked God for its secret properties and extracted from it so much different inventions that made him famous in his day. His name is George Washington Carver, known as the father of chemistry, a man who was born a slave to very caring owners. And this marker in Kansas shows that he was recognized as an absolute genius and one of America's greatest scientists who revolutionized agriculture in the South with his discoveries. In the South, a beetle called the boll weevil that feeds on cotton would cause havoc every year and destroy cotton crops that would devastate southern farmers' plantations. So Carver studied the soil and encouraged them to plant the peanut instead of cotton, and this saved the farmer from huge losses each year, where he produced publications and taught men the importance of the peanut and its benefits, and spent his entire life going around the country teaching a nation the importance of agriculture. As a child, Carver was very curious and had a hunger to learn. He would talk to God and would ask the right questions. God, what makes a stone a stone? Why is the grass green? And what makes a bird fly? He decided to put his faith into practice and enrolled in Simpson College. While studying at Iowa State, he was taught by Professor Henry C. Wallace, who later became the Secretary of Agriculture under President Warren G. Harding. Carver later became a teacher there and taught his son Henry A. Wallace in Iowa State in 1909. He followed in his father's footsteps and also became not only the Secretary of Agriculture, but the Vice President of the United States under President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Who would have thought that the man who had the second highest position in the US government was taught all of his agricultural skills by a former slave? They retained a continuous correspondence and a close friendship throughout, Wallace never losing the respect he had for the man who taught him agriculture. In 1916, Carver was appointed a member of the Royal Society in London, England. In 1918, he was appointed to the US Department of Agriculture. Carver could look at a plant and find out its secret properties, and he was beginning to be noticed by some of the most influential men in North America, one of them being the billionaire Henry Ford, the American industrialist who revolutionized the automobile industry and founded the Ford Motor Company. Ford was looking for alternatives for fossil fuels for his cars, known today as biofuels or biodiesel. And he worked with Carver trying out many different experiments where they worked together to enhance biofuel. Ford asked Carver to work for him, but Carver refused the offer, not because he was rude, but because he had a greater need. Though Carver made his mark in white corporate America, where he was even offered a 6-figure salary by Thomas Edison, he believed his greatest work should be among his own blacks. And when Booker T. Washington asked him to work for him, he took up the offer to be a teacher at Tuskegee University. Booker T. Washington convinced corporate America to finance his separate black enterprise. And the bearded person on Booker T. Washington's right, who was shown in the study previously as the 4th richest man who ever lived, the Scottish-American billionaire Andrew Carnegie, he was one of the many donors who helped this school to prosper, where students were driven to excel in education and morals so they could be the best in society. Carver was the most famous teacher there, where he not only taught students science and agriculture, but he also led out in Bible studies and taught each one of his students that they needed to depend upon God for everything. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt came down to Tuskegee to honor Carver for his great contribution to science and American civilization. Throughout his career, Carver was constantly awarded for the unique work he had done in the field of science by both universities and by top politicians. And even after his death, he had a bridge named after him in his honor, constructed in 2005. He had a ship named after him. He also had a US submarine named after him called the USS George Washington Carver, as well as a stamp and a coin in his honor. He became the first person in the United States other than the president to have a national monument named after him. When George Washington Carver was asked what made him so brilliant, he answered them with a simple response. The secret of my success? It is simple. It is found in the Bible. In all thy ways, acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. That is why George Washington Carver is my greatest inspiration. In one of the worst conditions of humanity, he was able to rise to the top without holding any anger. And we as God's people, despite the pressures we're going to face, we also have to learn from those examples. It's going to get tough, but God is going to see us through. The next study will be our last study in the two kingdoms.
The funny thing with people that, they consider Noah to be a benevolent figure, because he looked after the animals. Oh, Noah and the animals. It's like, kidding me? This is a dude that stood by and watched the entire population of the planet perish.